So, a little insight into how the Anglo Saxons would have celebrated Christmas. Just trying to paint a little picture of what it would have been like in those dark days of yore, a darker time when the lights of Yuletide shone all the brighter. The modern name December comes from the Latin decem, which meant 10, as there were 10 months in the Roman calendar. However, before that, the Saxons referred to the month of December as simply Yule. January was also known as Yule. So Yule, it is generally believed that it came from the word yore, meaning something to do with the wheel of the year. The Anglo Saxons actually once only recognized two seasons, winter and summer, with the year beginning at the winter solstice. The solstice then comes from the Latin for sun, sol, and sistere, to stand still. So the sun stands still at the winter solstice, and it could also be seen as a time of year when not only the sun, but society, work, and life stood still too, as conditions were too cold to grow crops, and you were only outside in the few hours of daylight that were even there during the cold, dark months of winter. It's no surprise then that deep in the darkest depths of winter, in the darkest depths of December, communities all over Europe engaged in a big festival in order to raise spirits. So the winter solstice kind of marked the end of the wheel of the year. O-E, Yule, wheel. Christmas, i.e. the 24th to 25th of December, was obviously celebrated in a very different way, as it was long before Christianity. There was no baby Jesus, there was no nativity, there was no wise men. The 24th to the 25th of December was known as Modernacht, or Mother's Night, and apparently there was a night-long vigil performed that evening by the medieval communities at the time. All this is according to Bede, who, for those of you who don't know, was a prominent English monk, author and scholar, best known for his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which was kind of about the conversion of the pagan Anglo Saxon tribes to Christianity. All those pagans with Modernacht, where we have Christianity, he probably said. So Bede said that the medieval Christmas period was called Modernacht, and probably because Bede was a Christian and a big protagonist of Christian faith, he probably didn't tell us what these ceremonies were, as he probably thought them unimportant. However, it's generally agreed that the Anglo-Saxon ceremonies were connected with a change of the seasons, and the end of the year was something a bit like the rebirth of the sun. It was always something of a nativity. So while we're here, nativity comes from nativus, which is Latin for arisen by birth. We can see that particle in natal, like in, antenatal clinic. Indeed, the French called it Noël, which means birthday. So it was always a time for celebration, whatever the weather. There was always a lot of feasting and rejoicing at the time of Yule. Thinking about it, the tradition of the Christmas tree was thought to have been an Anglo-Saxon tradition, where evergreen trees, such as the pine trees that we decorate today, were decorated with real apples and pears to mark the hope of greener pastures to come in the dark depths of winter, where most of the trees were threadbare. Holly, mistletoe, and Yules are also plants that are green all year round, symbolizing in those days the promise of spring to come. The tradition of hanging the trees with apples and other fruits is thought to be where we get our tradition of hanging baubles on our Christmas trees that we see today. You can imagine back then that food would have been fairly sparse in the winter, and great preparations would have been made to make the joyous feasts seen at the Christmas tables of yore. Indeed, the Anglo-Saxons lived more seasonally, with animals slain during November, which back then was known as blot monaf, i.e. blood month, and all the wares from harvest monaf, i.e. September, safely stored in the pantry to tide them over for winter. It's funny, on ancient runes, archaeologists found the sign of the horn turned upwards at the start of the festive period of joyous feasting, marking the horn being full, i.e. full of food. And then at the end of the period, the horn would be turned down, so marking the end of the period. The horn is empty, the horn has no more food in it. I get a real Game of Thrones vibe from people drinking out of horns, don't you? Talking of drinking, the mead hall, Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is really only some of the surviving literature of the time and the only surviving documentation of Anglo-Saxon times at all, reference winter as a time of sorrow and social isolation. You can imagine it must have been very dark and isolating to live on your own, no internet, only candles for light, and the days being, well, 80% darkness. One example is in Dure's Lament, which was written in the 10th century, where winter calder is described, winter cold. And of course the text The Ruin, where decaying cities bereft of life are depicted, their walls fastened with frost. Since my lord I buried deep in the dark earth, seeking, all bereft, some giver of treasure. In the famous text Beowulf, the attacks of the demonic monster Grendel plunged the kingdom into 12 long winters and a metaphorical endless night. This always reminds me of the lines from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by the great C.S. Lewis. A place where it is always winter, but never Christmas. So in Anglo-Saxon literature, the jolly mead hall is always depicted as something of an antidote to those long, cold winter nights, where people would eat, drink and be merry, keeping each other company. The folk gathered together to eat bread, meat and drink beer for the 2 weeks. The modern English ale is thought to be somewhat derived from the Old English aelu. See also the word in Old Norse, which was the Viking language, ol. The word actually has even more ancient origins, deriving ultimately from Proto-Indo-European, where the word meant something like sorcery, magic, and intoxication. Performers, skopas, recited poems and epic stories, accompanied by music from the Anglo-Saxon harp or lute. Oral transmission of songs was the most prominent way of entertaining, as the light in the hall would simply be too dark to read from, and apart from anything, most of the population at the time would have been illiterate. Who knew my own clan, or might console me, I, the friendless one, win with his welcome. And some of our traditions even hark back to these Anglo-Saxon times. Each year the Yule log was burned, which would be the remnants of the previous year's Yule tide log. Mistletoe, for example, in pagan times, was a sacred branch throughout Europe. Kissing under the mistletoe was thought to have been a popular tradition in 18th century England, popular with servants first before moving to the middle classes. Hope you enjoyed.